All right, hey everybody, this is Clarion, and today we're going to do a short and sweet breakdown of higher order components in React. So we're going to write out some functions, and then we're going to implement higher order components to these functions and enhance our overall code and performance. We're going to break this down so it's simple, it's easy to follow along. So if you have any confusion with higher order components, then we're going to do our best to clarify it and make this work for you. So this assumes that you have, a node and you can create React app, execute of your npx, and we make a we have our text editor here, and we have our application, our React application loaded up already. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and then we just run npm start, make sure that we're up and running on our local host, which I need to save. Okay, so you should be getting everything up and loaded, and you should have your text editor out, and we're going to go ahead and start. Quickly, right before we begin, what are we going to be doing? We're going to make a click counter that we're going to increment with some state. We're going to make a hover where you can hover over an element, and that will also have a counter that increments. Then we're going to look at these two sort of very similar structured components, and realize that with higher order components we could actually minify our code, and we can create an extensible component, and we're going to see how this can actually how higher order components can be beneficial for our code by looking at these simple examples. And it's fine if that doesn't really click yet. Don't worry about it. We're going to code along, and so it makes sense. But just right before we begin, higher order components, let's just go over it, make sure that we understand, we're on the same page. So a higher order component is basically exactly how the name implies. It's a higher order component. So if you have this component, that's your higher order component. It's going to be a component that takes a function as its parameter, and that function, it's going to return a function, and that function that it's returning is actually an inner component. So your higher order component, that could sound a little confusing, but just to simplify that even more, your higher order component is one component that wraps around an inner component. It could be any other component. And why does it do that? It wraps around this inner component to enhance it. So let's say that your inner component, just to make a relatable analogy, let's say coffee, right? Like, I love coffee. So let's say I'm drinking some coffee. So this is my inner component, is the coffee. And then the higher order component is going to be what enhances the coffee, something that I wrap around this coffee and enhance it. So maybe, if you're not a coffee snob, maybe some milk and sugar, right? So when you add the milk and sugar, you wrap it around the coffee, and then you've enhanced the coffee. So you've separated the milk and the sugar and the coffee, and then you apply the milk and sugar is your higher order component into this coffee, the inner component, and you get this new coffee, new style behavior. Let's say better, enhanced, modified. I'm actually drinking it black for the record. As black as moonlight, as midnight on a moonless night. Okay, so so that's it. So why don't we go ahead and start coding? So we'll go back in the text editor here, and why don't we build this click counter, build the hover counter, and then see, after we build that, how we can add a higher order component to make our code much more extensible in our application. Okay, so we make a new file in the source, and we're going to call it click counter.jsx. Now we say .jsx because it's using JSX. You could do .js as well, but for the syntax, I'm keeping it as JSX. So I'm going to what I'm going to do actually here is I could just show you this. So we can do a tab snippet. So if I do tab cer and I hit enter here, basically I get we're making a class-based component, so I'm going to get a class-based skeleton up. And how did I do this? Let me just title this click counter. So if you don't have snippets, if you're using VS Code, you can go and you can just type in React.js snippets here in your search for extensions, right? Because it's an extension. And if you find React.js snippets and you click on React.js snippets, You can install it, and it enables it globally. Okay, so for for all of your use cases here, and then it shows you the different examples. So instead of having, if you're typing a class-based component, instead of typing the whole class-based component out, we can just do that underscore CR, and then you have access to that. Okay, just a little side note. So what did we just do though? We just made a class-based component which extends, our component here from React. Okay, render in a return function, and it defaults the click counter. So it's rendering our JSX, which is some divs, which is being returned so that we can have access to that now in our DOM. So what do we do now is that we've done this. Well, it's a click counter, right? So we're going to have to there's going to be some state. So how do we do that? We bring in a constructor and we set up a super, okay? And then now we can actually we can do a this.state to initialize our state of a counter. So we'll call it count. And we will initialize it to numerical value, so 0. So we're setting our count to 0. Now our count is getting in the information, our state is being passed, that we have a numerical state of 0. Okay? Good. Okay, and the other thing that we want to do is, well, for now, why don't we just go ahead in our return, and above in our render over here, we're going to do a constant, and we're just going to destructure our count. So we're going to do this.state. So we need the this because we're accessing this from our constructor. It's a class-based component. So that's where we get the this.state of our count. And when we do this is basically in our div here would be the same thing that if we write this.state.counter, instead of having to write this.state.counter, we can destructure it by passing the this.state to our count. And then that way we don't need this dot state. We can just keep it as count. Okay? So, count. Okay, so now we can go ahead and save this, go into our app, and import it. So in our app, what we can do is we can remove the logo because we don't need it, and we can remove all of the stuff, all the templated code here that we don't need either. And we can just import click counter from from click counter, right? It's called click counter, and then all we have to do is return the component. So we can just do click counter, okay, save that, and we could go ahead now into at 0 being display SX into our main application from our click count, okay? Nice and easy, right? If that's a bit complicated for you, then I suggest that you got to be going back to your basics on React and work on your state. But this is assuming that you have already you've seen this before, and this kind of makes sense, and you can see your initial state. So we also want to add an increment now, right? So to do that, we can use ES6 and create we could call it increment function here, okay? And our increment, it's too early this morning for me. And inside here, we can set the state of our counter to increment, right? So how do we do that? This.set state. And remember, when we're setting state, we don't want to affect the state directly. And we can do this by affecting the previous state instead. And we can call a function previous state, and we can return. Now we can return and get our state, and we can set our state count prop over here to the previous state dot count. And what else would we want to do? I'll let you, you should. If you don't know this would be a good time to think about it. This is an increment. This is a function, remember, that's going to be incrementing our state. So if we just return this, nothing's happening. But if we, do a little addition here, +1, then theoretically this should now be adding the set state whenever we use this function, and and call it, we'll be adding a +1. Now to call it, what we need to have is a button, right? So what we can do is we can make this a button, actually. Our div, we're going to turn our div into a button, and we're going to use the event onClick here. OnClick, and remember that because it's JSX here, we have to use we're capitalizing our C, and then inside of here we would want to call this .increment. Okay, and now we don't need to bind our increment to this because of ES6 functionality, because if this was written as a regular function, then we would have to bind it, or a constructor. But because we're using ES6, we save this, and we go back to our dev here, and we click. Now we see we're incrementing. Excellent. So now is a good time to have a little coffee. All right. So we haven't actually looked at the higher order components yet. So we're going to do the same thing for a hover counter. If you're already familiar with all this, it really, you can just go ahead and skip these parts and just go up straight to the part where we are implementing our higher order component. But if you want to be coding along and just making sure that you're following along step by step, that's totally fine. And I encourage that as well. So here we are, and we have our state working in our click counter, right? And to go back to our coffee analogy over here, higher order component. So right now, what you have to think about it, think of the click counter as an inner component, but there is no higher order component, right? So it's just an inner component that is doing these basic things. It's just showing us what our state is, displaying the state, and giving us the ability to increment it whenever as long as my computer doesn't crash. Yeah, okay, and so that's working, but there's no higher order component as of yet, right? And there's no real reason to. If this was the extent of our application, then we don't need any sort of higher order component, right? Because why would we be implementing a higher order component? The whole point is to create extensibility in our code, efficiency, and to minify our code, and if the full the extent of our application is just this button and a click, then I would say call it. Like, don't bring in Redux, and don't bring in higher order components, and you don't need to bring in all these big mammoth libraries, or these higher kind of design concepts are not necessary, right? We don't have to memoize this. This is all good. But now we're going to look at an example of how this how can a higher order component benefit this click counter. Would be, let's say we had a bunch of other components that were similar as to a click counter, that was doing similar functionality, okay, with our state, let's say here. So if we go to our source, we make a new file and we call it a hover counter.jsx, and let's say the hover counter was very, very, very similar. Like, basically we're going to have an element that we're going to hover over in our application, and then it just shows you the increment that it's incrementing when you hover over it, okay? So again, if we bring in the story over here, and we call this hover counter, right? And then if we go to our click counter, we can just basically, it's going to do the same thing, right? We're just going to have some state that we initialize, so I can copy the constructor and the increment function exactly the same, okay? And we can even do the same, the structuring over here, constant count, it's going to be this dot state, okay? And then in here, though, what we want to do is maybe we have an H2, which we put our count in, and then we have a different event on mouse over, all right, which basically is now listening. It's an event that listens every time the mouse moves over the element, okay? And we set this to this dot increment. Save this, and then go to our app.js, and then bring in import the hover counter. What? Hover counter from from hover counter. Okay, and then under the click counter, we bring in the hover counter. So click counter, hover counter, save, go back into our environment. And okay, we see a 0 when we hover over it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and when we click here, all right, take a little coffee. Okay, awesome. So now we have our two. Now we have basically our two components that are working. Okay, in our application, we're hovering, and we're incrementing on this button click, and we have these two kind of events that are going on. Everything's working. So this is fine, right? So finally, now we can actually look at higher order components, because what is the issue here? Well, like we mentioned earlier, if you look at the hover counter and you look at our constructor and our state and our increment, it's basically doing the same thing in the click counter, right? It's like the exact, we just copy pasted the code, because essentially the functionality of these components are pretty much the same thing. The only real difference is that we're listening to different events. In the click, we're listening to click, and in this situation, we're listening to a hover. Okay, and the hover counter, right? So imagine if we had even more, right? Like, let's say that we had other types of listeners that were also incrementing when we did other things, like whenever we entered in an input, whenever we had a different type of event that was going on. So we had an application that had all these listening counter events, and then we had all these extra components that were similar to these, and we just kept rewriting over and over again, constructor, super, this, copy and pasting. Not so great, right? You don't want to be copying and pasting your code over and over again like that. It's not good for many reasons. And so this is an example now. Maybe this could start to make a bit more sense of how a higher order component can take this code. Essentially, we can take the functionality of the state of this count increment and put it in a higher order component, and then just, instead of writing all this code out, we wrap around our components that need it, that can use that functionality, the click counter and the hover counter, and wrap around that so we don't have to write all this code out, and instead take it from there. So instead of instead of having 50 coffees, or like 3 or 4 coffees, and then each coffee has its own unique amount of milk and sugar that you're pulling in from a different place that it comes with. Instead, what you do in your coffee shop is you have one place which has all of your sugar and all of your cream, and then the coffee goes to that place, and that's where you put your coffee and sugar inside of it. Makes a lot more sense, right, than having every time you have a coffee and sugar, you give them coffee, and you give them sugar and cream, and it's expensive time, it's expensive code, and we want to be smart coders, we want to be efficient. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I know it's an analogy, but anyway, let's go ahead and code it. If not, it's going to make more sense when we see it. So we go in our source, make a new file, and let's call this what should we call this? Enhanced. Should we call it enhanced component .js? Okay, and then this is going to import React, because we're going to do, it's going to be a function. Oops, what's up with this? All right, and we're going to do constant enhanced component. Maybe enhanced component. Yeah, let's rename this to enhance, actually. Let's keep it present tense here, because this is our higher order component, right? So we're enhancing our, the idea is that we're going to be enhancing these click counter and hover counter. So we'll see it. We'll see it when we see it out. So constant enhance component is going to take as a parameter an origin component, and that's going to be these, right? What we're going to be wrapping around, and this origin, okay? So then that's going to be a function arrow, and then inside of here, what we can return is actually, we can return a class-based component, and we can call this our mod. we call this mod component because it's going to be what we're doing to modify, right? So this is modify component, okay? So this is the function of our enhance component. And just, we don't need this import React. Okay, and just bear with me for a second. It'll make sense. And then we got to return this, make sure that our export default, the mod component export default is not export default because this would be in what is export defaulting from our React. But this will be a return, right? Because it's in our function. And instead, what we want to export default is the enhance component, right? So enhance component. And then origin component is a component that we could actually bring in here, origin component. And origin component is what can actually, we can pass props into this. And now let's just stop for a second and just look at the skeleton, because I know I just coded a bunch of stuff and maybe this is a little confusing. So why don't we just look at this briefly here. So what did we do? We have a function that we've just created called enhance component. It's our higher order component, right? And it's taking an origin component. An origin component is going to be our click counter and hover counter, what we're going to be wrapping around our higher order into our inner. But how a higher order component works is that it's a function, all right, that returns a function, another function, which is the mod component, the way that we modify our origin component, right? And then that we're using it class based, right? Because we're going to be, we set state into here to do our click events or whatever, but don't even worry about that for now. But this class based component then can be a function that we can actually pass the origin component through, okay? So if that doesn't make sense, that's fine, because we're going to look at it right now. If that makes a little bit more sense, awesome. But just for an example, so this origin component, let's say that the click counter was our coffee, right? This is, and the higher order components are milk and sugar. So we can set up we can call it enhance prop, okay? And we can set this equal to just a, we can just set it up to a string, and we can just say milk and sugar. And if we save this, okay, and then we go into our hover counter, let's say. If we go into our hover counter, if we import, now we can import enhance component from enhanced component, from enhanced component, right? And then what we can do now is, now that we've imported the enhanced component, our higher order component, into our hover, we can wrap our enhanced component around our hover component and then access the milk and sugar. And this was our coffee, right? So export default here, all we have to do is in our export default, we bring in the enhanced component and we wrap it around so it takes the parameter of hover component. So that's the origin component now. So now our hover counter, by wrapping it around and saving, and you go back to the enhanced component here, we are actually getting access now to the props inside of our origin component. And to show you this, in our H2 now, if under our counter here, we actually bring in enhance, and it would have to be, because it's a class-based, this dot props, because we're getting it from props, remember, and we save, and we go back into our thing, it'll say component is not defined, and our enhance extends. So because we didn't bring in component, remember component comes from React, so it has to be React component. Okay, there you go. So look at that, milk and sugar over our hover. Did you see what happened there? So that's our higher order component now working whenever we hover. So does that make sense? So in our hover counter, what do we do? Let's look again. Export default, we wrapped our hover counter into our enhanced component, right? So this is our enhanced component, higher order component, which has the property of milk and sugar. It wraps over the hover counter, and we have in our enhanced component this milk and sugar string, so that now when we go into the where is it? Yeah, when we go into here, we see milk and sugar in our local host is being reflected correctly. Awesome. So that means it's working. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. To speed things along here, that's great, but we're not actually in this particular context enhancing what our objective is, which is not to demonstrate the milk a contrived example, but to actually implement our state, right? So how do we do that, which is the next question. So all we need to do at this point now is we can just, again, copy and paste our constructor and our increment with our state here from the hover counter or from the click counter, same thing, right? So we're going to look at the click counter first, actually. So whatever, same thing, click counter, copy and paste the constructor and the increment, go into the enhanced component, and in our class-based function that's being returned, we can actually set up our constructor and increment in here. And now, instead of doing this milk and sugar in the origin component, we can get rid of this, and we have access now to our count, to our state and our increment. So what we could do is we can set up new props for the click and hover to take, right? Similarly, like we did with enhance, we can just write count equals this dot state dot count, okay, and increment equals this dot state dot increment. I'm keeping it the same, so it's just going to be easy to implement this. And if we save this, and then now we go into our click counter, let's say, we no longer, what we can do now is in our button on click, we now have, the first thing we need to do, sorry, I was getting ahead of myself, is we need to import, obviously, we need to bring in our higher order component. So bring in enhanced component from enhanced component, and then we need to wrap, if we wrap around our click counter, the enhanced component, okay? And now by wrapping around this, our click counter is going to go through this. This is into our origin component as the parameter. Then the constant exponents executes our other function here, our mod component, to mod our click counter. So it has the state, and then origin component is click gets access to basically the click counter, and now we have access to the props. Okay. Maybe it's following all this along, could be a little bit like a step-by-step, and I would break it down and make it easier, but the video is a bit long, so if you really want to get into like each little step, you know, you can look at it after. But essentially, let's just say now the origin component is giving us access now by wrapping it around to these props, just by wrapping it around, right? It's as simple as that. So now that we have access to props, we go this dot props dot increment and this dot props dot count, and we save. And notice how now the count over here has lost visibility. But if we go into our development and we click, we'll see that it's not working. And that is because of, sorry guys, this isn't state. So increment over here, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. There's no state on increment. It is a function, and this value is getting that. It's just early in the morning. I haven't had enough coffee, but if, you know, that should make sense because increment is a function, right? An arrow function that we are passing into it, which sets the state by incrementing our previous state of the count plus 1. So save that and we go back here and look at that. So it's working and it looks like nothing is changed or broken. But what's actually happened here? Well, now we can go ahead and we can delete the constructor and delete the increment. And we could go ahead and get rid of our destructuring here. We can save, go back, still working. And now we could even go further and we can refactor this back into a function, right? So we can just say constant click counter takes props because we're accessing the props from our enhanced component. We no longer need a render. I got to work soon. Button on click this dot props and now because it's no longer class-based component, we have no use for this. Save, and also, oh, actually, may as well just get rid of this. We're not bringing in component from React anymore. Great. So everything is working, and now we no longer have implemented all of our state into our click counter. Our click counter now is just it's a dumbed down component, and that's a good thing. You know, this is good because it doesn't need it's going to allow much more extensibility now because we don't need to be implementing all this state into this click counter if we know that we're using this click functionality for multiple components. And we can do the same thing that we did now with our click counter to our hover. So if we go to our hover counter, remember we no longer need our constructor, we no longer need our increment. This can just be a function that takes props, right? Let's go ES6 constant just to be consistent here. Constant hover counter. We no longer need a render method. We don't need to destructure. And we no longer need this. Look at that. Let's save this. And we don't even need the component again. So let's go ahead and save this. Increment is not defined, count is not defined. Oh, because increment, remember, has to be props dot increment. Count has to be props, right? And this we don't, enhance I got rid of, so we don't even need that anymore. Okay, save this. And oops. Oh yeah, and also remember that we already brought in the enhanced component before to show us about the coffee example, so we imported enhanced component and we're wrapping around the hover counter. Yeah, wait, what is that? This is an extra bracket we don't need. So now when we hover, it works. And when we click on that, it also works. And look at that. Look at how simplified our click counter and our hover counter is. And our enhanced component, our high order component, is now what's containing our state. And this is cool because this kind of gives you an idea now of when you're piecing your React and you're looking like big picture to structure React applications. And as they grow, you need tools like this in order to have maintained efficient structure that's fluid and extensible. And yeah, this is really cool. So I hope that makes a little bit of sense. That's really it, the gist of the video. And for an exercise, if you would like, what you could do is you could try adding another button, another click counter that decrements, a component that just decrements, and then apply the enhanced higher order component, wrap it around the decrement button.